All right, let's jump right in. We're about to unpack a letter that's, believe it or not, 2,000 years old. But it feels less like some dusty piece of history and more like an urgent email from a CEO to a manager out in the field. This thing is basically a crisis management playbook written from a seasoned mentor to his young protege, who's right there on the front lines. I mean, right from the get-go, the tone is set. Paul, the author, doesn't start with, "Dear employee." He says, "Unto Timothy, my own son in the faith." Just think about that for a second. Before he gets into any of the problems or the instructions, he starts with their personal relationship. What does that tell you? It tells you that for Paul, real leadership, it's not about a corporate org chart. It's built on a bedrock of trust and a shared mission.
So here's the roadmap for how we're going to break down this mentor's playbook. First, we'll look at the urgent mission Timothy was on. Then, how Paul wanted him to correct the course. After that, we'll get into the actual blueprint for leadership and the rules for the community. And we'll wrap up with Paul's final warnings and his big charge to Timothy.
Okay, so let's set the scene, right? You've got Paul, the senior leader, the founder, and he's moved on to his next big project. But he's made a really strategic call. He's left his number one guy, his most trusted associate, Timothy, behind in this huge influential city called Ephesus. And you have to ask, why? Well, it's because there's a fire he needs Timothy to put out, a big one. And what exactly is this fire? Well, it's not some threat from the outside. The community is literally being torn apart from within. Paul's instruction to Timothy is super direct. You have to stop people from teaching, and I'm quoting here, any other doctrine. See, a group of teachers had popped up, and they were introducing all these weird, speculative ideas that were just creating arguments and chaos. It was totally derailing the whole community from its core mission. So, if you're Timothy, what do you do? How do you even begin to fix a problem like that? Well, this brings us to section 2, and Paul's approach here is just fascinating. He doesn't start by handing Timothy a list of rules and regulations to shut people down. No, instead, he zooms way out. He reminds Timothy of the real goal, the big why behind everything they're even doing in the first place. And this is where you see the core conflict laid out so clearly. On one side, you've got the goal, which Paul calls godly edifying, which is just a fancy way of saying building people up in a healthy way. But on the other side, you've got the distraction, getting lost in what he calls fables and endless genealogies. He just dismisses it all as, get this, vain jangling. It's such a great phrase. It's really a classic case of needing to focus on the signal and ignore all the noise. Okay, this right here, this is basically the mission statement for the entire letter. Paul lays out what he calls the end of the commandment, the whole point of everything. And he says it comes down to 3 things, not rules, but 3 internal qualities: love that comes from a pure heart, a good, clear conscience, and a faith that's totally sincere, not fake. Every single rule that follows in this letter, it's just a strategy to get to this. And just to make sure this doesn't sound like some rigid, top-down command, Paul does something amazing. He gets incredibly personal. He reminds Timothy, hey, remember me? I was once a blasphemer, a persecutor. He says that he received mercy. He calls himself the chief of sinners. By doing this, he completely reframes the whole mission. It's not about being judgmental. It's about extending grace. That is a total masterclass in leading with humility. Okay, so with the mission and the core principles totally locked in, the letter makes a big pivot. It moves from the why to the how. The practical solution to all this chaos, a really clear blueprint for leadership. It makes sense, right? If you want to restore order, you've got to have solid, reliable leaders in place. So that brings us to the big question, one the letter spends a lot of time answering. What does a good leader actually look like according to this game plan? What are the real non-negotiables? So the list for a bishop, you can also think of that as an overseer, is pretty long. But what's really striking when you read it is that it's almost 100% about a person's character, not their talent or their charisma. You see words pop up like blameless, sober, hospitable. But the key litmus test, the real core of it, is this: how do they manage their own family? And the logic is super straightforward. If you can't lead your own small household well, how on earth are you supposed to lead the entire community? And it's a similar story for the deacons, who were the ones serving in a more hands-on, practical way. The qualifications echo those same themes of character. They need to be serious, honest. He uses this great phrase, not double-tongued, two-faced, and not greedy. But then there's this really fascinating requirement added in. They have to be proven first. This isn't a role you can just jump into. There's basically a trial period to see if their character can actually hold up when things get tough. And this quote right here, it just perfectly sums up the whole why behind all these detailed job descriptions. Paul says he's writing all this so that Timothy knows how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God. See, this isn't about creating some rigid corporate structure with a bunch of red tape. It's about establishing the culture of a healthy, functional community. All right, let's keep going, because this letter isn't just for the leaders. It actually broadens its focus and gives specific instructions for pretty much everyone in the community. The idea is to make sure everybody knows their part in creating a place that's orderly and healthy. This table gives you a pretty good snapshot of these community-wide instructions, and you can see a couple of core themes popping up again and again: order and mutual respect. For example, men are told to pray without getting into arguments. Women are encouraged to let their adornment be their good works, not just expensive clothes. And look at this, the letter even sets up a kind of social support system with really detailed rules for how to care for widows. It's all about establishing a principle of respect, whether that's giving double honor to good leaders or servants showing honor to their masters. Okay, and that brings us to the final section. This is where the mentor, Paul, gives his protege, Timothy, some of the letter's most powerful warnings. And then he wraps it up with a very personal, very direct charge to just stay the course. And this is where we find one of the most famous lines, probably from the entire letter, and it's aimed squarely at those false teachers who were very likely making a quick buck from their confusing ideas. For the love of money is the root of all evil. But Paul's point isn't just that it's a moral failing. He presents it as a dangerous trap, one that's caused people to completely wander away from their faith and bring a whole lot of pain on themselves. So, if the love of money is the poison, what's the antidote? Well, the letter offers this really powerful counter-principle. Godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, the real profit, the real win in life, isn't what's in your bank account. It's found in your character and in your sense of peace. And this all builds to the big finale, a final 5-point action plan just for Timothy. It's this rapid-fire charge. He tells him, flee from the love of money, follow after things like righteousness and godliness, fight the good fight of faith, keep this commandment pure, and avoid those profane and vain babblings that he was sent there to deal with in the first place. It's a perfect, powerful summary of his entire mission, all boiled down into 5 direct commands. So when you step back from it all, what are we left with? You've got this ancient letter, this memo, that's dealing with internal division, what it means to be a good leader, and the dangers of greed. It was a playbook for Timothy back then, for sure. But it really makes you think, doesn't it? In our own companies, our own communities, even our own families today, which parts of this playbook for creating order and staying focused on the mission still ring true? What does it really mean to lead well in our world?